In a museum drawer in China sits an X-ray of a woman's foot. It does not look like a foot. The bones are folded under themselves, the arch crushed almost in half, 4 toes bent completely beneath the sole until they nearly touch the heel. This was not an injury. This was not an accident. Someone did this to her on purpose, starting when she was a small child, and she lived the rest of her life inside the shape it created. Imagine being handed a body that felt permanently wrong, not because of illness or age, but because of a standard your entire community had agreed on before you were even born. Now imagine being told the fix was simple. Break it, rebuild it, live inside the new version for the rest of your life. You would not have needed convincing the way you might think. You would have grown up surrounded by people who had already made that exact trade and considered it worth it. The honest question is not why would anyone survive that. People clearly did, for centuries across an enormous range of cultures that never spoke to each other. The real question is what could possibly be worth breaking your own bones for? Deliberately, sometimes as a child too young to consent, sometimes as an adult who chose it freely. The answer turns out to be 4 completely different motives that all led human beings to the same conclusion. Status, grief, medicine, endurance. Sometimes the body had to be broken first, before it could become what a person, or their family, or their culture actually wanted it to be. Most of what we know about this comes from the bones themselves. Bioarchaeologists can identify an intentional fracture versus an accidental one by looking at the pattern of the break, the angle, and how evenly the bone remodeled around it afterward. X-ray and CT scanning let researchers look inside preserved remains without damaging them, revealing healed fractures that would otherwise be invisible under skin and muscle. Historical medical texts fill in the rest, describing procedures in exact detail, sometimes with instructions precise enough to follow today. Between the bones and the writing, a surprisingly clear picture emerges of exactly how and exactly why people chose this. Foot binding in China is the most extensively documented case of deliberate bone breaking in human history, and the process was neither quick nor gentle. The practice is generally traced back to the Song dynasty, spreading gradually over centuries from elite court circles into much broader segments of society, before it was formally banned in the early 20th century, though it continued in some rural regions for decades after the ban existed on paper. Beginning around age 4 to 7, before the bones of the foot had fully hardened, a young girl's toes were curled under the sole of her foot and bound tightly with long strips of cloth. Over the following weeks, the 4 smaller toes were gradually broken and folded beneath the foot, and the arch itself was forced to bend and eventually fracture, pulling the heel and the ball of the foot closer together. The bindings were rewrapped tighter every few days for years, not months, years, reshaping the foot permanently into a curved point small enough to fit inside an embroidered shoe roughly 3 to 4 inches long. The pain did not end once the bones healed into their new shape. Walking itself became a permanently altered, often difficult act for the rest of a woman's life, since the foot could no longer distribute weight the way an unmodified foot naturally does. Many women who underwent the procedure as children described the first 2 years as the most physically difficult of their entire lives, a detail that survived in personal accounts and interviews collected well into the 20th century, long after the practice had mostly ended. It was not done for a single reason. It was status, because tiny bound feet became a visible marker of a family wealthy enough that their daughter did not need to perform hard physical labor. It was marriage, because for centuries a young woman with unbound feet in certain regions and eras had dramatically reduced prospects of marrying well regardless of her character or family background. It was tradition passed directly from mother to daughter, generation after generation, often performed by the very women who had endured it themselves, out of genuine belief that skipping it would harm their daughter's future far more than the procedure itself ever could. How many mothers wept while binding their own daughter's feet, believing completely that they were protecting her? How many girls were told the pain would fade, only to discover it never fully did? How many generations passed before anyone outside the culture that practiced it understood it was never about cruelty at all? Not every deliberate fracture in history was about beauty or status. Some were entirely medical. And the ancient world understood far more about bone healing than most people assume. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of ancient Greek medical texts, describes something that sounds almost unbelievable today. Physicians recognized that a bone which had healed crooked, a malunion, could sometimes be deliberately rebroken and reset in order to heal correctly the second time. This required understanding that bone actively rebuilds itself after a fracture rather than simply scarring over like skin, a level of biological insight that predates any concept of cells or biology as a formal science by well over 2,000 years. Egyptian medical papyri describes splinting techniques, detailed enough that modern surgeons recognize the underlying logic immediately, using materials to hold a rebroken limb rigid while it healed for a second time. Wooden splints, linen padding, resin-soaked bandages. Roman military physicians, working under far less controlled conditions on active campaign, are recorded performing similar corrective procedures on soldiers whose battlefield fractures had been set poorly or not at all in the chaos of combat. Understanding that a soldier who could not properly bear weight on a badly healed leg was permanently lost to the army either way. The goal was never harm. The goal was function, choosing a second controlled injury over a lifetime of permanent disability from the first one healing wrong. Grief produced its own category of intentional bone injury, and one of the clearest documented examples comes from the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Among the Dani people, a practice recorded by anthropologists into the 20th century involved women, and sometimes men, amputating a portion of a finger following the death of a close family member. This was not symbolic in the abstract sense. It was a literal physical sacrifice performed at the moment of deepest grief, removing bone and tissue as an outward expression of loss that words alone could not carry. The logic behind the practice, as recorded by researchers who lived among the Dani, connected physical pain directly to spiritual protection. A belief that the pain of the amputation appeased ancestral spirits and helped prevent further misfortune from visiting the family. Multiple amputations across a lifetime, following multiple deaths in a family, were not unheard of, meaning some elders carried the visible history of every major loss they had survived directly on their own hands. No words, no ceremony alone, just the body itself, permanently marked by exactly how much had already been lost. It would be easy to lump every culture that reshaped the human body into one single practice, but that flattens a genuinely important distinction: cranial deformation. The deliberate elongation or flattening of an infant's skull using boards, cloth wrapping or cradle boards, was practiced across an enormous range of cultures: the Maya, the Huns, communities across ancient Europe, and the Andes. It looks at first glance like it belongs in the same category as foot binding. It does not. An infant's skull is made of separate bony plates connected by flexible, unfused sutures, specifically so the head can pass through birth and continue growing afterward. Sustained gentle pressure during infancy reshapes how those plates grow relative to each other. Nothing is fractured, nothing is broken. It is closer to guiding a young plant along a trellis than breaking a branch using the body's own natural growth process rather than fighting against it. Skulls recovered from Andean burial sites show dramatically elongated shapes, achieved entirely through this gradual, non-violent method, sometimes maintained across an individual's entire childhood using increasingly adjusted wooden frames as the head continued to grow. The distinction matters, because conflating gentle reshaping with deliberate fracture erases exactly how differently these cultures actually approached the human body. Not every ancient modification was a broken bone. Some were simply patient guidance, applied consistently for years. Warriors and initiates in a number of documented cultures faced deliberate physical trials that sometimes resulted in genuine bone injury, used specifically as evidence of endurance rather than as a goal in itself. Ritual scarring, controlled beatings, and physically demanding endurance tests appear across ethnographic records from multiple continents, historically tied to marking the transition from childhood into adulthood or into full warrior status within a community. The injury itself was rarely the point. Surviving it, and being seen to survive it, was. A young man who flinched, failed in front of everyone who mattered to him. A young man who endured it silently earned something a ceremony alone could never grant, proof, carried on the body that the community's trust in him was not misplaced. The scars and healed injuries from these trials functioned less like punishment and more like a resume, permanent and impossible to fake, worn openly for the rest of a person's life. None of this would have been survivable at all without a biological system working quietly underneath every single example in this video. Bone is not inert scaffolding sitting passively inside the body. It is living tissue, constantly being broken down and rebuilt by two types of specialized cells working in opposition, one dissolving old or damaged bone, the other laying down new bone in its place. When a fracture happens, whether by accident or entirely on purpose, the body responds by flooding the area with a soft, temporary structure called a callus, essentially biological scaffolding that hardens into new bone over the following weeks. A principle called Wolff's Law describes how bone actively remodels itself in response to the mechanical stress placed on it, growing stronger and denser exactly where it is needed and thinner where it is not. This is not incidental to the story. It is the reason the entire story is even possible. A body that could not reliably heal and reshape its own skeleton would make foot binding, medical rebreaking, and every other example in this video a death sentence rather than a deliberate choice. Every culture on this list was, in a sense, working directly with a biological repair system the human body had already evolved millions of years before any of them existed. Consider what that actually means. A 4-year-old girl's foot, and a badly healed Roman soldier's leg, and a grieving Dani elder's hand were all healing using the exact same underlying cellular machinery, the same specialized bone building and bone dissolving cells running the same repair program, regardless of whether the injury came from a mother's binding cloth, a physician's careful hands, or a mourner's own decision in a moment of unbearable loss. Different intentions, different cultures, different centuries. The same biology underneath every single one of them, using deliberate injury the same way ancient dentists used willow bark. As an external decision layered on top of a healing process, the body was always going to run, regardless of who caused the initial damage. None of this should be romanticized, and the honest version of this story includes real, serious costs. Foot binding routinely caused chronic pain that lasted a lifetime. Permanently restricted mobility. It left women vulnerable to repeated infections in feet that could never be fully cleaned or ventilated properly inside tight binding. Some bound feet became so severely infected that toes were lost entirely to necrosis, a complication some families considered an acceptable risk rather than a reason to stop. Circulation problems, muscle atrophy in the lower leg, a permanently altered gait that increased the risk of falls in old age. All common, documented consequences that lasted decades after the initial binding process ended. Bone rebreaking, even performed by a skilled ancient physician, carried real risk of infection in an era with no understanding of germ theory or antiseptic technique, meaning a procedure intended to restore function could just as easily end in a worse outcome than the original injury. A soldier or patient who agreed to a second fracture was gambling with genuinely limited information, trusting a physician's experience rather than any guarantee of success. None of the cultures practicing these traditions were ignorant of the pain involved. They simply judged individually and collectively that the outcome was worth it, a calculation modern audiences are free to disagree with, but not one made carelessly or without understanding exactly what it cost. Dismissing these practices as simple ignorance misses the point entirely. Every family that bound a daughter's feet, every physician who rebroke a malunion, and every mourner who chose amputation understood the pain in advance. They chose it anyway, weighing it against a cost they judged to be worse. Compare all of this to how deliberately reshaping the human skeleton looks today. Limb lengthening surgery, an entirely elective modern procedure, involves surgically breaking the leg bones on purpose and gradually pulling the two segments apart using an external frame, allowing new bone to grow slowly into the widening gap over months of controlled, deliberate injury. People choose this today for height, for correcting significant limb length differences or occasionally for purely cosmetic reasons, undergoing a process that described plainly is not conceptually different from what a Chinese family chose for a daughter centuries ago: elective facial bone contouring, jaw reshaping surgery, and a range of other modern cosmetic procedures all still rely on the exact same underlying principle ancient physicians and ancient families understood instinctively. Break it correctly, control the healing, and the body will rebuild itself into whatever shape the plan called for. The tools changed completely. Titanium plates instead of cloth strips, controlled anesthesia instead of nothing at all, sterile operating rooms instead of a family home. The underlying decision that a temporary controlled injury is worth a permanent desired outcome has not changed even slightly. You live inside a body that is, at this exact moment, capable of surviving and rebuilding from a deliberate fracture, whether you ever choose to test that capability or not. Every ancient example in this video was a different culture discovering the same fact independently, that the human skeleton is not fixed. It is negotiable, if you're willing to pay the price of breaking it first. If any of this surprised you, that is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to dig into, and subscribing is the easiest way to catch the next one. Back to that X-ray in the museum drawer. Knowing everything now, the folded, crushed shape inside it stops looking like an artifact of cruelty and starts looking like something closer to a physical record of belief, sacrifice, and status, carried inside a body for an entire lifetime. Every fracture in this story, chosen by a mother, a physician, a mourner, or a warrior, was a bet that the pain of breaking something on purpose was smaller than the cost of leaving it exactly as it was.